the New York Times has sued OpenAI and Microsoft for copyright infringement. And this is kicking off now what could be a landmark legal battle over how AI systems like ChatGPT are being trained. In this lawsuit, the Times alleges that both OpenAI and Microsoft's AI tools illegally trained on millions of copyrighted articles and materials from the New York Times website specifically. According to the text of the lawsuit, quote, through Microsoft's Bing Chat, recently rebranded as Copilot, and OpenAI's ChatGPT, defendants, i.e., OpenAI and Microsoft, seek to free ride on the Times' massive investment in its journalism by using it to build substitutive products without permission or payment. What's more, the Times claims that it was particularly targeted by OpenAI and Microsoft. So this lawsuit says that while the companies copied from many sources, they gave Times content particular emphasis when they were building their LLMs. The lawsuit does not come yet with a price tag for these damages, but it does say that the companies should be held responsible for, quote, billions in damages. It also calls for OpenAI and Microsoft to destroy any models and training data that use copyrighted material from the New York Times. So, Paul, there's a lot to unpack here. First up, in a recent tweet, Walter Isaacson, who is the famous author of the Steve Jobs and Elon Musk biographies, he said that lawsuits like this one from the Times, quote, will be the most important cases for journalism and publishing in our lifetime. He seems to think it's a big deal. How big a deal do you think this is?
I think this one is a really big deal. One, it's the New York Times. Two, the case appears to be very well made. I mean, I didn't read the whole 300 plus page filing, but the analysis of it indicates it's a really big deal. I think it's helpful to take a slight step back and understand like why this is happening and what's at stake. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit here, but again, just for like foundational understanding purposes, these models are trained on data. So when we go and use ChatGPT or Grok or Claude or Pi or whatever your chosen large language model and chatbot is, it is trained on data. The way it's able to output, whether it's an email or a newsletter or an ad or an image, is that it has this data that it learns from. Now, the higher quality the data, the better the model. So if you're going to train a model that is able to write, you want it to learn from the best content available. So if you take GPT-4, which is still the most powerful and capable model in the world, you want the best examples of writing and the greatest depth of knowledge. So you need legitimate sources, not just a bunch of Reddit boards and Twitter threads. So in past episodes, this is why we've discussed how Google, Meta to some degree, Amazon, they may have advantages given the fact that they have their own proprietary data and platforms. So again, if you're Google, you have YouTube as an example. You have way more than that, but YouTube is one key example. XAI/Grok has Twitter data. If they can get rid of the noise and misinformation, that can be really valuable. But if you're OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere, Inflection, and others, you don't have your own data. You are a language model company. You're building models on other people's data. The argument here is they may not have had the permission or well, they definitely have the permission. They may not have had the legal rights to train on other people's data. So there's uncertainty around whether or not training the model is fair use. But these AI companies certainly knew going in that it was a gray area that was likely going to be challenged legally. We know that to be a fact, that there's internal discussions around questions of are we even allowed to do this? But finding an answer to that is going to take a really long time. This isn't like this case is going to be settled in 3 months and OpenAI is going to have to destroy GPT-4 because it was trained on New York Times data and you can't extract that specific data set. That's not what's going to happen here. This is going to take a long time. The other thing I think we need to consider in all of this is the media companies whose content is used to train these models struggle. Like they rely on traffic, in many cases from search engines, to support their ad revenue models. That traffic and those business models are at risk as consumer behavior evolves, and maybe they don't get as much traffic from these search engines. So there's a lot of things because, the consumer, you and I, we may start going directly to the chatbots or to AI agents to find the information we need. We might not go search anymore, and therefore we might not land on the New York Times, and they might not be able to sell the ads. So there's a lot of things at play here. Um, when we get though into the strength of the legal case, as you called out, like we're not the attorneys here. We're not going to be the ones that are going to say this is legit legal case and they've got
Mm.
great grounds. But what you and I do is we find the people and follow the people who are authorities on these topics, who have way more information and knowledge on this. So I know you and I both read the Cecilia Zanetti, I think is how you say her name. Um, she's an IP and AI lawyer and former general counsel at Replit, one of the AI companies that you and I both love.
Mm.
And so she had a great thread on Twitter that we'll link to, and I'll just call it a couple of the things she highlighted. So she said, first, the complaint clearly lays out the claim of copyright infringement, highlighting the access and substantial similarity between New York Times articles and ChatGPT outputs. Key fact, this is again quoting from her, New York Times is the single biggest proprietary data set in Common Crawl, which is used to train GPT. Now, in her thread, she has a screenshot from the legal filing that shows the Common Crawl. So here's what it says. And again, this is coming right from the OpenAI New York Times filing. The most highly weighted data set in GPT-3 Common Crawl is a quote copy of the internet made available by a 501c3 organization run by wealthy venture capital investors. The domain www.newyorktimes.com is the most highly represented proprietary source and the third overall behind Wikipedia and a database of US patent documents, represented in the English language subset of a 2009 snapshot of Common Crawl, accounting for 100 million tokens. What that's saying is when these models are trained, most of them, I think, use this Common Crawl data set. So it's not like OpenAI goes directly to New York Times and gets all of their data and scrapes it. I don't think at least that's how it occurs. They use the Common Crawl data set, which is made up of New York Times data. But not only New York Times data. The number 4 on this list is the LA Times. Number 5 is the Guardian. Number 7 is Forbes. 8, Huffington Post. 11, Washington Post. Like you start going down this list and you realize we're just talking about the tip of the iceberg here. Because if the New York Times has a case, then so does the Washington Post and Forbes and Huffington Post. Like all of them have the same exact potential issues. So that's a really big problem. Like if this opens up the floodgates for these lawsuits, New York Times isn't the only one that's in Common Crawl that's being used to do this.
Mm.
The second point she makes is the visual evidence of copying in the complaint is stark. And then she shows an example where it literally gave a verbatim output of like 400 or 500 words. And so they kind of prompted it to where it gave this plagiarized output. This is straight up plagiarism. Like this isn't even a debate. So it's there in the reports, and it's going to be very hard to dispute that. Her take was OpenAI can't really defend this practice without some heavy changes to the instructions and a whole lot of litigating about how the tech works. It will be smarter to settle than fight. Her fourth point, failed negotiations suggest damages for New York Times. OpenAI is already licensed from other media outlets like Politico. And then she says the refusal to strike a deal may prove costly, especially as OpenAI profits grow and more examples happen. My spicy hypothesis, she goes on to say, OpenAI thought they could get it out of it for 7 or 8 figures. New York Times is looking for more and an ongoing loyalty. So the overall take here is licensing deals are going to be way easier than litigation. So, I think that's going to be a key thing. The other context I'll add real quick is Andrew Ng, who, you and I both follow, one of the leading AI people in the world right now and founder of Coursera and Google Brain Team and all those things. So he had a tweet that we'll, again, put in there and then a related blog post where he said, after reading the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft, I find my sympathies more with OpenAI and Microsoft than with New York Times. So this is kind of like a counterpoint, sort of interesting. He said specifically, number 1, claims, among other things, that OpenAI and Microsoft used millions of copyrighted New York Times articles to train their models. He says, I understand why media companies don't like people training on their documents, but believe that just as humans are allowed to read documents on the open internet, learn from them, and synthesize brand new ideas, AI should be allowed to do so too. I would like to see training on the public internet covered under fair use. Society will be better off this way, though whether it actually is will ultimately be up to legislators and courts. And then I'll kind of finish my thoughts here, Mike, and I'd love to get your opinion here. I had reposted that Andrew Ng article on Twitter, and someone asked a question about like training versus learning and whether or not it should be illegal to do this. And so my response was, and I'll just kind of read this because it's simpler. The legal arguments between training and learning will be intriguing. I could definitely see a path forward in which the courts allow the training learning because the AI companies succeed at convincing the judge or judges it's not really different from humans. But the companies building the models and potentially the end users, you and I and everyone listening to this, are still liable for copyright infringement and plagiarism on the outputs, also like humans. But as I said earlier, it will be years before this is all settled. And my best guess is the AI companies end up paying a few billion to settle without admitting wrongdoing to make these lawsuits go away. And then they train all future models, GPT-5 and beyond, or whatever Bard's built on, Gemini. They'll train all these future models on proprietary, licensed, and synthetic data. They'll just get around this by we're just not going to train on stuff that we're stealing from people anymore. So I still think it's possible that the leading AI companies, this is kind of like a bigger idea. I think we talked about this on a prior podcast. My one theory is that it's possible these AI companies buy or build their own media companies to power future models. Then they control the source data and they get to influence the narrative and public in the process. So if you think about like Bezos owns the Washington Post. Benioff owns Time Magazine, right? So he's got all the archives for Time Magazine. Like if Salesforce wants to train to, so it's already actually kind of started happening. And now you have like Elon Musk owns Twitter. So you're seeing it happen. And I almost wonder if that isn't the play because OpenAI and others can pay millions or billions in licensing fees and basically rent the data. Or they can just buy the media outlets for less and scrap a dying advertising model that's barely sustaining journalism as is. Like journalism is dying. You can't fund local journalism through ad models. And so in this great ironic twist, there's a chance AI actually saves journalism rather than steals from it. But then we deal with the fact that these AI companies now not only determine like knowledge, but they get to control what is truth. Like it's such a fascinating topic. So going back to your original question, is this a big deal? It's a huge deal, I think, because it's not just one case. This has ripple effects throughout, the impact on search, the impact on journalism, the impact on how the models are built. It's going to be so crazy to watch how this all plays out. What are your, I mean, do you have a feeling one way or the other? Like, is it going to be illegal? Like, what are they going to do? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't, I'm still in kind of my first draft of thinking about the topic, but I largely agree with you that I don't see a future where realistically the demands in the New York Times' lawsuit or anyone others to shut these models down or destroy training data actually happens. I mean, how many times has that ever happened? And do we anticipate it to happen? I certainly could be wrong, but I think that kind of leads my line of inquiry to kind of what comes next. And that's kind of where I wanted to, wrap up this discussion and double click a little more on the licensing side of it, because we talked a little bit about the Times, said in its lawsuit, it tried to negotiate some type of content licensing with OpenAI. That fell through. We've seen some other reports that we'll link in the show notes that OpenAI has actually offered some media firms like $1 to $5 million annually to license their content, which seems really, really low to me. Is there any possible future here where licensing actually works? Because I'm more and more in your camp where I think, why not just buy the information, the content itself in the form
I
of
think
the outlet?
in the near term, it could, but I just feel like whoever owns the data has the power in the future, and I can't see the AI companies giving up that power. So, like I could see them playing nice until they don't need to anymore. Like we know Google has licensing deals. We know Apple's been in negotiations. Rumor is that they're going to do something significant by Q3 of this year with Surrey, and
Mm.
definitely doing something with their own language models already. They're building them. So they're also trying to license data. They have their whole news platform. Like if you're an Apple News reader, like they have access to all that, and they could extend licensing deals with those companies. But what I had heard, and I'll try and see if I can find the article to put in the show notes, was that Apple doesn't just want licensing; like they want future rights to this stuff to build other content on top of, or build other models on top of, and it so I think that the licensing is gonna get complicated, but the reality is the media companies need the AI companies probably more than the AI companies need the media companies. And so right now, the media companies have the leverage because there's a pretty good chance that the AI companies probably weren't allowed to do what they did. So they may have to pay, some fines for that. Um, but moving forward, there's belief they can use synthetic data. Like, okay, you're not going to play ball with the New York Times. We'll go do a deal with the Washington Post. Like, there's other ways to get the data and build these models. And so I just feel like right now, again, media companies probably have some leverage in this because they need this data to do this. But fast forward 1, 2, 3 years down the road, and I think that leverage will probably shift to the AI companies, whether it's because they just buy the media companies or they find other ways to get proprietary or synthetic data to train on, or they just do deals with other partners and move on from them. So I don't know. It's going to be really fascinating to watch.
Yeah. And one final note here, which could be a whole topic for a future podcast. It occurs to me that there might be an interesting discussion moving forward around sort of what we might call niche media properties, like in different verticals. I mean, eventually you could see some interest from model companies in getting more specialized content around different areas if that ends up being valuable to training versions of their models or fine tuning existing ones.
Yeah, and that's do you see a fracturing where there isn't like a general model where you go in and just assume ChatGPT is going to tell me anything, or
Right.
like for example, I mean, who could build a better product model than Amazon? Like they have
Mm,
all those, millions or hundreds of millions of products, and they know everything about them. It's all sitting in databases. So, if I wanted to interact with any kind of find a product for anything, any lifestyle, any need, um, you would think that's something Amazon could build better than anybody. And
mm.
and so is that, are there travel agent bots? And like, do you actually interact with individual specialized bots? But I know like the plan for like these large models would be to, in essence, have AI agents that are specialized in all these areas. And so I could still go to ChatGPT and I'm looking for a product, but it's actually pulling the AI agent that's trained on product data, and
Mm.
that's the one that's actually feeding the outputs back to me. So I think at the end of the day, the big models probably still win. We want to go to one place like a Google versus
Yeah.
15 places to find our specialized data.